Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series. We opened the leadership conversation this month by encouraging a proactive versus reactive approach to conflict resolution. And the point we tried to make was basic, but I still think it was insightful, which is that if conflict is already present, you missed your best opportunity to resolve it. And there are countless real-world examples available that reveal that early diagnosis and treatment is the best way to mitigate a problem. This is true of disease, and it's true of organizational conflict. With that in mind, I want to share a popular framework known as Situation Behavior Impact, or SBI, which emerged during the 1970s, 1980s out of the Center for Creative Leadership. What's interesting about tapping into this particular framework is that the researchers behind the development of SBI would not have described it as a model for conflict resolution. However, that's because these same researchers would agree with our premise, which is if conflict has already arisen, you've probably taken several missteps already. CCL's broader philosophy is that leadership is learned through experience, reflection, and feedback. And the research consistently shows that one of the greatest barriers to leadership development isn't a lack of intelligence or a lack of technical knowledge. It's a lack of clear, actionable feedback. The question they're asking is plain but profound. How can someone improve if they're unsure exactly where they're falling short of expectations? So SBI was designed with a very simple objective. Make sure the conversations that happen between managers and direct reports achieve the intended improvements. For this to happen, the developers established 4 expectations for effective feedback. It needed to be more objective, easier for managers to deliver, easier for employees to receive, and more likely to produce a change in the behavior. And if we consider these 4 intentions, it's pretty easy to see how, even though it wasn't intended as a template for conflict resolution, SBI can significantly lower emotional temperature and reduce the potential for conflict. Essentially, the model was designed to address a common communication problem in organizations, which is that managers often provide vague feedback that comes off as unclear or judgmental or overly focused on the person rather than on the observable actions. A good example of this might be when a manager tells an employee that they need to improve their attitude. Or maybe a manager comes up to someone and says that they're being unprofessional. This kind of feedback isn't helpful or effective. SBI grounds itself in 3 elements to eliminate these problems. S stands for situation. So to begin, we want to establish the specific situation or context. And we want to be precise. During yesterday's project meeting, when we met with the client on Tuesday, in your presentation this morning, right? The goal is to anchor the conversation in a shared event or a shared moment. B stands for behavior. And here we describe exactly what happened, or we describe the person's observable actions. And I can't stress enough how B is the heartbeat of this model. For SBI to work, we have to focus our attention on observable behavior. And this takes some discipline. And for some people, it takes extra discipline. Because our natural inclination is to speculate about people's motives or to try to speculate about the reasons or influences. But with this model, we want to imitate that old detective named Friday. Just the facts, ma'am. So let's return to one of the situations I listed above to continue our example. A common and poor way to communicate might be this way. When we met with the client on Tuesday, you were disrespectful. That's the kind of vague statement that we're trying to avoid. We want to be clear and direct about what the observable behavior was that we deemed to be disrespectful. So trying this on again, we might say, when we met with the client on Tuesday, you interrupted her 3 different times to offer answers before she had the opportunity to finish explaining the problem. Instead of telling a direct report that he isn't committed enough, tell him how you've arrived at that realization. Your report was submitted 2 days after the deadline. Always deal with observable behaviors. Finally, I stands for impact. And at this stage, we focus our attention on the effects of the behavior. This is an essential part of feedback because now you're linking what was observed to an outcome, whether that's slowing down production or demoralizing the team or eradicating trust with a long-standing partner. So let's use our running example to close out the framework. When we met with the client on Tuesday, you interrupted her 3 different times to offer answers before she had the opportunity to finish explaining the problem. She became quiet, and afterwards, they emailed me asking for clarification. The meeting was ineffective, and even worse, they felt unheard. So you notice by sticking to this framework, a manager doesn't need to be afraid that the conversation will devolve into contentiousness, nor do they need to worry about whether their message is clear. Because in this framework, you've established the exact moment, the exact context, the observable behavior, and the outcome. And sure, the employee can choose to agree or disagree on any of those 3 items, but by taking this approach, you've reduced the likelihood that they feel personally attacked or mistreated. Ideally, if this conversation is handled with calm professionalism, they're going to sense that your assessment of the situation isn't based on random, uninformed speculation or personal biases that you hold. And finally, research shows us that the most ineffective feedback we can give to someone is the type that skips right to conclusions and assumptions. The SBI framework, if it's followed carefully, dissolves those suspicions of unfairness, the very same suspicions which inevitably lead to conflict. And that's huge. But SBI does even more than lower our emotions. If a manager and an employee can agree on what happened, both the observed behavior and its impact, they're far more likely to have a productive discussion about making positive changes and finding ways to improve. And it also prevents employees from becoming identified by a poor decision or a mistake. SBI creates a healthy separation between the observed behavior and who the person is beyond that moment or beyond that isolated incident. Oh, and here's the proverbial cherry on top. SBI leans deeply into a growth mindset. Because the message you're sending to your team member is essentially, you did something to create this problem, but you're also capable of doing something to resolve the problem and to ensure that the problem doesn't arise again. And that leaves room for personal growth rather than personal shame. And that's a cultural value that the very best organizations in the world constantly work to maintain.